$1. That was all he had when he pushed through the saloon doors. One crumpled, sweat-stained bill that had been in his pocket for 3 weeks, through river crossings and dust storms and nights on hard ground with a saddle for a pillow. He stood in the doorway for a moment, letting his eyes adjust from the blinding afternoon sun to the smoky dimness of the room. The smell hit him first: tobacco, spilled beer, the particular sour quality of a room that had absorbed years of human activity without ever being fully cleaned. Around him, men sat at tables talking, arguing, laughing, losing money at cards. A piano somewhere in the back was playing something that might have been a recognizable song before it had been played this many times by these hands. He walked to the bar, laid the dollar flat on the sticky counter, and looked at the bartender. $1. And in the American West of the 1870s, that single bill was going to determine a great deal about the next 24 hours of his life. Welcome to Mystery Wild West. Tonight, we are going to do something a little different. We are going to follow a single dollar bill through the economy of a frontier town and understand in detail what that piece of paper could actually buy in the years when the American West was being built. What a dollar meant when a cowboy earned about $1 a day, when a meal cost a dime and a shot of whiskey cost 5 cents, when that one bill in a man's pocket represented the difference between eating and not eating, between shelter and sleeping outside, between being armed and being defenseless in a place where being defenseless was a serious problem. The purchasing power of money is one of the most direct ways into understanding what a time and place was actually like for the people living in it. And tonight, that is exactly where we are going. If you are new here, subscribe and stay a while. We tell real frontier history every week, the kind that goes beneath the mythology to the actual conditions of actual lives. If you have been with us before, welcome back. Now let's get into it. Because the dollar was waiting on the bar, and the bartender was waiting for a decision. Before we can understand what a dollar could buy in the frontier West, we need to understand what a dollar represented in the lives of the people spending it, and that requires some context that the mythology of the Wild West has almost entirely erased. The working men of the American frontier, the cowboys, the miners, the farm hands, the laborers who built the railroads and the towns and the ranches, earned wages that, by the standards of the period, were modest to the point of bare adequacy. A working cowboy on a cattle drive in the 1870s earned approximately $30 a month. That was $1 a day, more or less, for work that was physically brutal, that exposed him to every weather condition the frontier produced, and that kept him away from any settlement for weeks or months at a time. A miner in a western mining camp might earn $1 to $1.50 a day for underground work that was loud, dirty, dangerous, and destructive to the long-term health of the men who did it. A farmhand earned similar wages, with the addition of room and board that reduced the cash component but didn't much change the fundamental financial position. In this context, the single dollar bill in a man's pocket at the end of a cattle drive or a mining shift was not a trivial amount. It was a day's labor. It was the unit of measurement against which everything else was priced. And the specific purchasing power of that dollar, what it could and could not do, was something that every man in these circumstances understood with a precision that people today, accustomed to prices that bear no obvious relationship to daily wages, can barely reconstruct. The equivalent value of a frontier dollar in modern terms is a calculation that historians approach with different methods and reach somewhat different numbers on, but the most commonly cited figure is that $1 of the 1870s had roughly the purchasing power of $30 today. That number helps with some comparisons and obscures others. The things that were cheap on the frontier were very cheap: certain foods, basic labor, the fundamental commodities of a simple economy. The things that were expensive were often extremely expensive because the cost of transporting anything to remote frontier settlements was built into the price of everything. And transportation across the frontier before the railroad was neither cheap nor reliable. The working man who arrived in a cattle town or a mining town at the end of a season with a month's wages in his pocket, perhaps $30, was not, by the standards of the place and time, a wealthy man. He was a man with enough money to meet his basic needs for a few weeks, to enjoy some of the leisure that the saloon economy offered, and to prepare for the next season of work. The choices he made about how to spend that money were choices with real consequences, because the next dollar was weeks of hard labor away, and the margin between having enough and having nothing was thin enough to feel. Think about that for a moment. $1 a day for work that was genuinely hard and genuinely dangerous. And in that context, the decision about whether to spend 5 cents on a shot of whiskey or save it toward the next month on the trail was not an abstract question. It was the actual financial arithmetic of a life. What would you have done, arriving in town after weeks on the trail with $30 in your pocket and 6 months of hard country behind you? Would you have been careful with it? Let me know in the comments. Let's start where most frontier evenings started, at the bar, with the question of what to drink and what it cost, because the economics of frontier drinking are both more interesting and more disturbing than the mythology suggests. The whiskey served in most frontier saloons, the standard drink, the thing a man ordered when he ordered whiskey, was not the aged bourbon of the movies. We have discussed this before in the context of saloon life, but the economic dimension of it is worth examining specifically. A shot of this whiskey cost between 5 and 10 cents at most frontier saloons during the peak decades of the cattle era. At 5 cents a shot, a man with $1 in his pocket could, in theory, consume 20 shots before the dollar was gone. That is a mathematical fact that tells you a great deal about both the price of the drink and the quality of the drink. The substance being sold at 5 cents a shot was not a product whose production costs justified much more. The coffin varnish that most frontier saloons served was produced from raw grain alcohol, colored with burnt sugar, flavored with chewing tobacco or other adulterants, and sometimes further modified with turpentine or creosote to give it a stronger, more aggressive character. The cost of producing this substance was minimal. The markup at the bar was substantial, and the effect on the body of the person consuming it was, as the name implied, not gentle. Beer was priced similarly, 5 cents a glass at most establishments, and shared many of the quality characteristics of the whiskey, if in different form. Frontier beer was served at room temperature because refrigeration did not exist. It was often flat because carbonation degrades over time, and the beer being served had been sitting in a barrel for however long it had taken to get from wherever it was made to wherever it was being sold. In more isolated settlements, the beer was sometimes extended with river water by saloon owners who had calculated that their customers' tolerance for dilution was higher than their tolerance for not having beer available at all. This calculation was frequently correct. The economics of frontier drinking were, for the saloon owner, excellent. The cost of the raw materials for coffin varnish was low. The price charged was 5 cents or more per small glass. The volume, consumed by men who had been on the trail for weeks and who had very little else to do with their evenings, was high. And the social dynamics of the saloon, the obligation to buy rounds, the social cost of refusing a drink when one was offered, the way that each drink loosened the judgment about whether to have another, were all mechanisms that drove consumption upward from whatever the customer had intended when they sat down. The saloon economy was not designed to help its customers make financially responsible decisions about their drinking. It was designed to extract as much of their available money as possible in the time they were willing to spend in the room. The amount that men actually spent on drink in a single night at the saloon was, by multiple contemporary accounts, frequently an entire week's wages or more. The cowboy who arrived in Dodge City with $30 and left 2 days later with nothing had not been swindled in any obvious way. He had simply participated in an economy that was very efficient at moving money from his pocket to the saloon owner's strongbox through the mechanisms of cheap drinks, social obligation, gambling, and the accumulated desire of a man who had been without these pleasures for a very long time. The gambling tables of the frontier saloon represented a specific and interesting economic proposition for the men who sat down at them. The promise was the transformation of $1 into something larger, the chance to convert a day's wages into a week's wages through skill or luck or some combination of the two. The reality, as with all gambling, was that the house's mathematical advantage ensured that the aggregate outcome across all the men who sat at those tables was a transfer of wealth from the players to the establishment. Faro was the most popular gambling game in the frontier saloon of the 1870s and 80s, more popular than poker during the period, though poker's subsequent mythology has reversed their relative reputations in the popular imagination. Faro was a banking game in which players bet on which cards would appear when the dealer drew from the deck, and it offered odds that were, by the standards of gambling games, relatively favorable to the player, closer to even odds than most casino games of any era. This relative fairness was part of its appeal, and legitimate faro dealt honestly was genuinely competitive. The problem was that legitimate faro dealt honestly was not what many frontier players encountered. Marked decks, crooked dealing boxes, dealers who worked in coordination with the house to manipulate outcomes. These were endemic to the frontier gambling economy and were documented extensively in the accounts of the period. The men who ran gambling establishments understood their business as the extraction of money from customers, and the techniques available to that end were used in proportion to the likelihood of detection. In a town where the law enforcement was either absent or compromised, and where the customers were transient and would not be around long enough to compare notes across multiple sessions, the incentive for honest dealing was limited. With $1, a man could buy 10 cents worth of chips and sit at a faro table for several hands at the minimum bet. If he ran well, he could extend that dollar into several dollars. If he ran badly, he could be broke before the first round of drinks was finished. The accounts of men who sat down with modest stakes and left with nothing, or of men who sat down with nothing and found themselves further in debt than the stake they had brought, are consistent enough across the period to be considered a regular rather than exceptional outcome of frontier gambling. Poker, played at the same tables in the same rooms, offered a different dynamic, one in which skill played a larger role than in faro, and in which the competition was between players rather than between players and the house. The minimum bet at many frontier poker games was 10 cents, which meant that $1 could buy several hours of play at a careful table, or could be gone in one ill-judged hand at an aggressive one. The men who were genuinely skilled at poker could, and sometimes did, turn modest stakes into significant winnings over the course of an evening. The men who overestimated their skill, or who were simply unlucky, found that the arithmetic moved in the other direction just as quickly. The shootings and serious confrontations that gambling disputes produced were a real feature of the frontier saloon economy. Though not as frequent as the mythology suggests, the accusation of cheating, which was often correct given the prevalence of the practice, carried a particular weight in a culture where honor and the code of conduct around honesty in transactions were taken seriously even by men who did not always observe them. A man who was being cheated and who could not prove it through legal channels had limited options, and in the frontier saloon those options included a direct confrontation that could quickly become very serious. The gambling table was a place where money, honor, and the presence of weapons created a specific kind of tension that the management of frontier saloons had to navigate constantly. The food economy of the frontier town is one of the areas where the mythology has been least accurate, partly because eating is less dramatic than drinking and gambling, and partly because the realities of frontier food were not particularly romantic. But for a man arriving in town with $1 after weeks on the trail, food was not a secondary consideration. It was often the most urgent one. A basic meal in a frontier town of the 1870s, a plate of beans and salt pork, perhaps with bread or biscuits, served in one of the eating establishments that operated alongside or within the saloon buildings of most cattle towns, cost approximately 25 cents. That is $0.25 for a meal that was, by any nutritional standard, adequate in calories if not in variety. With $1, a man could eat 4 meals. Given that the trail diet had been beans and hardtack and salted meat for weeks, a meal served hot on a plate in an actual room was not merely fuel. It was a genuine pleasure, and the men who had been on the trail longest appreciated it in proportion to how long they had been without it. The quality of the food in frontier town eating establishments varied with the quality of the establishment and the supply chain that served it. In a well-connected cattle town, like Dodge City in its peak years, the better establishments could offer real variety. Fresh eggs when the season allowed, beef from the drives that passed through, bread baked daily, coffee that had been roasted recently enough to still have flavor. In a more isolated settlement, the food reflected the supply chain, dried goods that had made a long journey, preserved meats, whatever could be grown locally in the short growing season of the plains, supplemented by whatever game was available. The cost of provisions for the trail, the food a man bought to carry with him when he left town, was an important part of the dollar's work. Flour, dried beans, salt pork, coffee, baking soda for biscuits. These were the staples of the trail diet, and they could be purchased at the general stores of most frontier towns at prices that, while higher than Eastern equivalents, because of the transportation costs involved, were within reach of a man with $1 to spend. A pound of salt pork cost approximately 10 cents. A pound of beans cost about 5 cents. Coffee was 5 to 10 cents for a small quantity. For 25 to 50 cents, a man could provision himself for several days on the trail if he was careful and if his expectations were appropriately modest. The relationship between food and money in the frontier economy was one that shaped behavior in ways that the mythology does not capture. Men who had just arrived in town after weeks of trail food sometimes spent money on a decent meal before they spent it on whiskey, because the body's hunger was more immediately compelling than the desire for drink. Men who had been in town for a few days and had spent most of their wages on less essential items sometimes found themselves choosing between food and ammunition, between eating and being armed, in a place where being unarmed was a genuine vulnerability. These were not dramatic choices in the cinematic sense. They were the ordinary, grinding financial decisions of people living close to the margin. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. In the frontier town economy we are describing, a man could spend his entire month's wages in 2 days at the saloon, or he could make the same amount last a month if he was disciplined about it. The difference between those two outcomes was not just about the man's character, it was about the specific economic environment of the frontier town, which was designed by the people who built it and ran it to extract money from transient workers as efficiently as possible during the brief period those workers were present and spending. The saloon economy was a machine for separating men from their wages, and it was a very effective machine. Does knowing that change how you think about the men who spent everything in a single night? Leave your thoughts in the comments. The frontier town offered, alongside its more dramatic pleasures, the fundamental human comforts of cleanliness and sleep for a price, and the economics of these basic necessities tell a story about what frontier life actually cost and what it meant to be able to afford the minimum of civilized comfort after weeks on the trail. A hot bath in a frontier town cost 25 cents. For that quarter, a man received a wooden or tin tub filled with water that had been heated on a wood stove, a bar of soap, a rough towel, and perhaps 15 minutes of privacy in which to use them. The establishment providing this service was typically a bathhouse that operated in connection with a barber shop or a hotel, and it was staffed by people whose job was to heat water continuously, manage the flow of customers, and maintain whatever minimal cleanliness standards the establishment's reputation required. The bathing arrangements in most frontier establishments were not, by modern standards, particularly hygienic. The water in the tub was heated once and used by successive customers in order, with the earlier customers getting cleaner water and later customers getting progressively less clean water until the tub was finally emptied and refilled. A man who paid for the first bath of a clean tub was getting something genuinely useful. A man who was the 6th customer of the morning was getting something that was warm and wet and smelled of soap, which was still better than nothing, but was not exactly the cleansing experience the advertisement implied. For a man who had been on the trail for weeks, who had been sleeping in his own sweat and trail dirt, who had crossed rivers in his clothing, who had been eating and working and sleeping in the same garments without anything approaching a proper wash, even the 6th customer's bath was an enormous relief. The physical sensation of hot water and soap after extended trail travel was one that the accounts of the period describe with a consistency and an intensity that makes clear it was not a minor comfort. It was a restoration of something basic and human that the trail had stripped away, and the 25 cents it cost was money that almost everyone who had it was willing to spend.
A bed for the night cost 50 cents in most frontier town hotels of the 1870s, and what that 50 cents purchased was considerably more modest than the word hotel implies today. A frontier hotel room was
typically a shared space, a room with multiple beds or multiple rooms connected into a dormitory arrangement, where men who did not know each other slept in adjacent or shared bunks for the simple reason that private rooms were expensive and the demand for cheaper accommodation was high. The beds themselves were wooden frames with straw or cotton mattresses that compressed over time and were changed infrequently. The sheets, when there were sheets, were laundered with varying degrees of regularity. The company in these shared sleeping spaces was unpredictable and not always reassuring. Cowboys and miners and gamblers and men of less clearly defined occupations shared the same rooms, and the security of personal property in this environment was whatever a man could maintain through his own vigilance. Theft was common enough that experienced travelers kept their valuables on their person even while sleeping. Boots held close to the chest, money belt kept on through the night. Any item of value treated as something that might not be there in the morning if it was left unattended. The 50 cents bought a horizontal surface with something soft on it and a roof overhead. Security and privacy were additional commodities that the price did not include. On busy nights, during the peak of the cattle drive season, when the trail ended and hundreds of cowboys arrived in Dodge City or Abilene or Caldwell within a few days of each other, even the shared rooms filled beyond their intended capacity. Hotel operators who had discovered that the demand for sleeping space exceeded their supply of beds had a direct financial incentive to sell the same sleeping space twice, which some of them did, resulting in the specific discomfort of two strangers discovering at midnight that they had both paid for the same mattress. The frontier operated with a general pragmatism about such things, and the resolution of this situation depended on the relative sizes and temperaments of the parties involved. One of the most revealing ways to understand the frontier economy of the dollar is through the price of ammunition, the cartridges that made the guns that the mythology has made into the central symbol of the Wild West actually function. Because the economics of ammunition on the frontier tell a story that directly contradicts the gun-heavy image of the period. A revolver cartridge of the standard calibers used on the frontier in the 1870s, the .45 caliber rounds used in the Colt single-action army, the .44 caliber rounds of the Winchester rifle, cost approximately 10 cents apiece. With $1, a man could purchase 10 cartridges. A standard revolver held 6 rounds in the cylinder. 10 cartridges was just over 1.5 reloads. That is the entire ammunition budget for $1. Now consider what that meant for men earning $1 a day. A man who fired 10 rounds in an afternoon of practice was spending the equivalent of a day's wages on the practice session. A man who carried a revolver and wanted to maintain any meaningful reserve of ammunition was constantly making decisions about when it was appropriate to fire and when it was not, because every discharge represented a real fraction of his income. The image of the frontier gunfighter blazing away with careless speed, firing until the gun was empty and immediately reloading, is an image that the economics of the period do not support. Ammunition was expensive enough that it was husbanded with care, and men who had to choose between bullets and bread sometimes chose bread because the immediate consequence of not eating was more certain than the probability of needing to fire. This economic reality reshaped the way guns were actually used on the frontier in ways that the mythology has entirely obscured. The weapon that was always loaded and always available was not always a weapon that was fired. It was, more often, a deterrent, present, visible, and credible, but used as infrequently as circumstances allowed because the cost of using it was real and the supply of replacements was limited. A man who emptied his gun in a confrontation and could not afford to reload was a man without the primary tool of his safety until he could earn enough to buy more cartridges, and that was a position that no one in the frontier environment wanted to be in. The stores of frontier towns sold ammunition by the round, not only by the box, precisely because the demand for individual cartridges from men who could afford 1 or 2, but not 20, was a consistent feature of the market. A man who came into town with $1 and who was weighing the choice between whiskey and ammunition was making a calculation about what he most needed for his immediate survival, and the answer was not always obvious. Whiskey was available everywhere, and the social and psychological relief it offered was immediate. Ammunition was finite, and the threat it protected against was probabilistic. The choice between them was one that the frontier regularly forced men to make. The cost of firearms themselves was a significant barrier for many frontier workers. A new Colt single-action Army revolver, the standard sidearm of the period, cost about $17 at retail in the 1870s. That was more than half a month's wages for a cowboy. A Winchester rifle cost more. The men who carried good firearms had either earned enough to afford them, inherited them, or acquired them in ways that did not necessarily involve paying retail prices. Men who could not afford the best weapons made do with cheaper alternatives, with older and less reliable designs, or simply went without. The universal armament vision of the frontier that the mythology projects is another instance of the imagery replacing the economic reality that produced it. The economics of the frontier saloon included a category of transaction that the mythology has handled with a combination of romance and sanitization, and that the historical reality handled with neither. The women who worked in frontier saloons occupied a complicated position in the social and economic structure of these establishments, and understanding that position requires separating the different kinds of work that were performed there and the different economic arrangements that governed each. The dance hall girls, the women who danced with customers, kept them company, encouraged them to drink, and provided the social animation that kept men in the saloon spending money, were employees of the establishment in a specific and clearly defined sense. They were paid a portion of what the customers paid for dances, which cost 25 cents for one song, and they typically received a commission on the drinks that customers bought after each dance, because the dance was explicitly designed to move the customer from the dance floor to the bar. The dance hall girl who was good at her job was good at keeping customers spending, which meant keeping them in the saloon, keeping them buying drinks, keeping them paying for additional dances. With $1, a man could pay for 4 dances. That dollar moved through a specific chain of transactions, part to the dance hall girl directly, part to the saloon owner from the dance fee, and an additional amount to the bar from the drinks that the dance protocol reliably produced. The economics were transparent and efficient. The saloon made money on the dance, and then made additional money on the drinks the dance generated, while the dance hall girl earned a portion of the dance fee and kept a percentage of the drink commissions. It was a system designed to extract maximum value from each customer contact. The dance hall girl and the prostitute were different categories in the frontier economy, though the mythology has often treated them as interchangeable. The distinction mattered economically and socially in ways that the people involved understood clearly. A dance hall girl was an employee with a relatively defined job description and with some degree of social standing, not respectable standing by the norms of the period, which excluded her entirely from polite society, but a position that offered more stability and more control than the alternative. The earnings could be substantial for the time and the work, and some women used those earnings to eventually establish their own businesses or to achieve a degree of financial independence that would have been unavailable to them in the occupations that polite society offered to women. The other category of work in the frontier saloon economy operated under separate and considerably harsher conditions, with prices that ranged from 25 cents to $1 or more, depending on the establishment and the specific circumstances. The women who did this work came from a wide range of backgrounds: widows, women who had migrated west and found themselves without the support structures they had depended on in the East, immigrants whose poverty gave them few alternatives, women whose other circumstances had led them to an economy that was brutal and short in ways that the people in it understood clearly. Life expectancy in this work was low. Disease was endemic. The economic power in the relationship was entirely on the side of the owner, not the worker. The dollar that passed through this economy was doing several things simultaneously. It was buying a specific service, it was sustaining an establishment, it was flowing into the pockets of owners who profited from the labor of women whose alternatives were limited. And it was, in a very small and very direct way, keeping specific people alive for one more day in circumstances that the frontier's economy had produced and that the frontier's social structures provided almost no escape from. Understanding this without either romanticizing it or reducing it to simple moral condemnation requires holding the economic reality clearly, the wages, the alternatives, the conditions, the outcomes, and recognizing that the people in this economy were responding rationally to the conditions they found themselves in, even when those conditions were genuinely terrible. $1. We started there, and we have followed it through the frontier town economy in enough detail to understand what it actually was in the context of a specific time and place. Let's step back now and think about what all of this tells us about the frontier and about the people who lived in it. The first thing it tells us is that the frontier economy was not the free, self-determining paradise of the mythology. It was a specific economic system with specific power structures, and those structures consistently moved money from the pockets of the working men and women who earned it in difficult conditions to the owners of the establishments that served them. The saloon owner, the gambling hall operator, the hotel proprietor, the bathhouse keeper, these people were not neutral providers of services. They were business people who understood their customers' vulnerabilities and built their operations around exploiting those vulnerabilities efficiently. The cowboy who arrived in town with $30 and left with nothing was not simply a victim of his own weakness. He was also a product of an economic environment specifically designed to produce that outcome. The second thing it tells us is about the hierarchy of needs in the frontier economy. When a man with $1 had to decide how to spend it, the order of his decisions reflected what the frontier actually required of him. Not whiskey first, despite the mythology's emphasis on drinking. Water and food first, because the body's demands could not be deferred indefinitely. Then ammunition, because the environment was genuinely dangerous, and being unarmed in it was a real vulnerability. Then shelter, because the alternative was sleeping outside in whatever weather the frontier produced. Then the social needs, drink, company, entertainment, that represented the human desire for more than bare survival in conditions that often reduced life to exactly that. The third thing it tells us is about the gap between the mythology and the material reality of frontier life. The imagery of the Wild West, the effortless gunfighting, the casual abundance, the freedom from material constraint, is an image produced by people who did not have to live on $1 a day in conditions where that dollar had to cover food, shelter, safety, and the accumulated needs of weeks without any of those things. The actual men who lived in these conditions understood money with a specificity and a seriousness that the mythology entirely erases, because the mythology was produced after the fact by people for whom the hardship had become picturesque rather than present. The fourth thing, and perhaps the most important, is what this tells us about the people themselves. The men who arrived in frontier towns at the end of cattle drives or mining seasons with $30 and 6 months of hard country behind them were not the romanticized heroes of the Western film. They were working people, operating under genuinely difficult material conditions, making the best decisions they could with the information and the resources available to them. Some of those decisions were wise and some were not, in exactly the proportion you would expect from ordinary human beings under extraordinary pressure. They drank too much sometimes. They gambled more than they should have sometimes. They spent money they could not afford to spend on things that gave them temporary relief from conditions that were genuinely hard. None of this is surprising. All of it is human. The dollar that was laid on the bar at the beginning of tonight's story moved through the frontier economy and left traces in all the places we have examined. Some of it bought whiskey that made someone feel briefly better and worse in the morning. Some of it bought food that kept a body going for another day. Some of it bought cartridges that never had to be fired. Some of it went to a woman whose name is not recorded and who was making the best calculation available to her in circumstances that the frontier had produced and provided no escape from. And some of it, if the man was careful enough or lucky enough, might have survived long enough to become the seed of the next dollar, the modest foundation of some small improvement in the material conditions of a life that needed all the improvement it could get. The frontier dollar tells the story of the frontier itself, not the one the movies made, but the real one, made of hard work and thin margins and decisions made under pressure and the specific kind of endurance that comes from not having the luxury of giving up. Before you go, I want to ask you one final question. Of all the things a dollar could buy in the frontier town we have been describing tonight, the whiskey, the gambling, the bath, the bed, the ammunition, the dance, the meal, which one do you think represented the best value? Not in financial terms, but in human terms. What would have mattered most to a man who had been on the trail for 6 weeks and finally had $1 to spend? Tell me in the comments. Every answer tells me something about what we understand of the lives these people were living. If tonight took you somewhere worth going, leave a like on the video. It helps more than you know and tells us to keep making history like this. Subscribe to Mystery Wild West if you have not already. Real frontier history every week. The kind that looks at the actual conditions of actual lives rather than the version the mythology produced. Share this with someone who thinks they know the Wild West. The dollar in that man's pocket knew more about it than the movies ever showed. We will be back next week. Until then, take care of yourself and remember that $1 used well in the right circumstances, in the right moment, was worth everything.